Next, it was going to be me, along with everybody else who'd counted one. While everything outside was flashing and exploding, I thought for a moment about numbers. Usually people begin counting with 1. Why had they started with 3 this time? But I could only pose the question. Before there was time to consider it, my turn had come. Nummer 1, nachgern, los. After a moment of hesitation, I sprang from my shelter like a jack-in-the-box into madness. Everything looked grey through a thick fog of whirling, choking dust, except for the glimmering flashes of light. In a few jumps, I had reached the foundation of a shattered hut where a German soldier had died staring at the open breech of his machine gun. It's strange how often human beings die without any kind of style. 2 years before, I had seen a woman run over by a milk truck and had nearly fainted at the sight of her mangled body. Now, after 2 years in Russia, visible death meant nothing at all, and the tragic element of even the best murder novels seemed petty and frivolous. With my watering eyes, I stared through the smoke, trying to see the enemy and do my duty. About 25 yards away, some trucks exploded into little fragments, one after the other, engulfing 4 or 5 running soldiers. Were the men German or Russian? I couldn't tell. I was with 2 companions in an open shelter made of logs packed with dirt, which the Russians had built to take a machine gun. We were more or less sitting on the mangled bodies of the 4 Popovs who'd been killed by grenades. "I did that bunch in with 1 shot," shouted a strong young soldier from the Gross Deutschland. A burst of mortar fire forced us down into the heap of enemy corpses. A shell hit the edge of the bunker, and the earth and logs blew apart, falling back onto our heads. The fellow huddled between me and a dead Russian was hit. As his body jerked up from the impact, I tensed myself to run. Another shell struck the shelter, disintegrating it. The debris poured down onto my legs and sent me reeling back against the opposite wall. I howled for help, sure that my legs were broken and afraid to move. My trousers were ripped down the leg, but the bruised skin underneath was unbroken, although I could trace the red-violet passage of the blow I'd taken. I plunged back into the heap of Russian corpses, falling onto the fellow who'd been hit a moment before. He let out a howl. We lay side by side with our heads touching as an avalanche of rubble poured down all around us. "I'm wounded," he groaned. "Something is burning in my back. Call for a stretcher." I looked at him and dazedly shouted, "Sanften Trager!" But my ludicrous cries were lost in the deafening uproar of 2 Spandaus firing quite near us. The big fellow from the Gross Deutschland was shouting at us to advance as loud as he could. "Come on, fellows! Some of our boys are already at the water tank." I looked at the wounded man, who was staring at me with desperate, imploring eyes and clutching my sleeve. I didn't know how to tell him that there was nothing I could do for him just then. The big soldier had jumped out of the shelter. I pulled myself brutally away and turned my head. The wounded man called again, but I had already jumped from the shelter and was running like a madman after the other fellow, who was nearly 15 yards ahead of me. I joined another group who were hurriedly setting up 2 trench mortars and helped them maneuver the tubes into position. Instantly, our mortar bombs were shooting almost straight up. A lancer, whose face was pouring blood, shouted that the Russians had withdrawn to the central tower. The veteran, whom I hadn't noticed before, let out a savage howl. "Got 'em!" As he shouted, a white flash lit his face, which was covered with an incredible layer of dust, and a geyser of flame enveloped the tower. The Russian defence crumbled and fell under the impact of our concentrated fire. Our assault groups moved in and cleaned up the last resistance. Another German soldier fell, clutching his face, and then it was all over, except for a few widely scattered shots. I and my companions ran into the ruins of what had once been a factory, but was now reduced to rubble beyond classification. Once again we were victorious, but the victory gave us no joy. Stupefied by the noise and the nervous tension, we wandered among the twisted, collapsed metal roofs. A lancer with a face drawn by exhaustion mechanically picked up an enamelled plaque which had something written on it in Cyrillic characters, perhaps a direction or the word for toilet. The town had fallen to us. There were about 300 prisoners, in addition to 200 enemy dead or wounded. The non-coms regrouped us and led us back through the smoking devastation of the village. Herr Hauptmann Vesreidau reviewed his 2 companies and called roll. About 60 men were missing. We collected the wounded and regrouped them to wait for our 3 orderlies to give them first aid. There were about 15 wounded men, including Holen Grauer, whose right eye was gone. Finding water was difficult. The breakers had been smashed, and we finally had to lower soup kettles down a well in the ashes of one of the isbas. The water was black with soot. The wounded were screaming with pain. Most of them were delirious. There were also about 75 Russian wounded, who presented a dilemma to our commandant. In principle, we should have helped them too, as best we could. But we were under orders to rejoin our division as soon as the operation was completed, so we abandoned the Russian wounded and piled ours into and onto the vehicles we had, which bore no resemblance to ambulances or even to ordinary trucks, a few gun carriages and a couple of light artillery tractors. We felt exhausted, disgusted, and numb. There was also the question of how to move the prisoners. There was no room in our collection of already overloaded vehicles. Finally, a sidecar fitted with an FM slowly drove some 50 of the prisoners along ahead of it. We turned them loose 2 days later, for lack of anything better to do with them. As an autonomous group, we were faced with extremely difficult problems of supply. In theory, the vehicles carrying munitions and gasoline picked up the flotsam of war as their loads grew lighter. But the division already had some 1,100 prisoners, and we didn't know what to do with them. We set off with clusters of men, German and Russian, hanging on to everything that could roll. We all looked back at the town, from which a thick cloud of smoke was climbing and spreading out to the horizon. The dark grey sky was threatening rain, which would soon fall on the graves of 40 German soldiers sacrificed to neutralize a single point of enemy resistance, which we weren't even interested in holding. We moved on to another operation, not as part of any design to conquer, but simply as part of an attempt to protect our vast withdrawal of troops to the west bank of the Dnieper. No one smiled. We knew that our victory couldn't make any difference to the outcome of the war, and only hoped that it might have some strategic interest. The experience of the battle itself had been, as always, more fear, and, for some, like my friend Grauer, irreparable mutilation. A young blonde soldier, huddled beside the driver of the machine which was carrying about 30 of us, began to play on his harmonica. The melody rang softly in our nearly insensible ears. "Mit dir, Lili Marleen! Mit dir, Lili Marleen!" The music was slow and filled with a nostalgia that weighed heavily on our exhaustion. Hals was listening, his mouth hanging half open, making no sound and staring at nothing. We drove for an hour, which meant about 30 miles, before it grew dark. We were all anxious to stop so that we could get rid of the thick, choking dust which coated us from head to foot. We were also exhausted and longing for sleep. Although a good bed in a warm barracks would have been paradise, any place where we could have stretched out and lost consciousness would have done. We knew that when we did stop, we would collapse onto the ground and sink immediately into blackness. The dark sky was filled with heavy black clouds lit up on their outer fringes. Large drops of rain began to fall as the storm broke. The rain, so often a curse, seemed like a blessing this time, washing off the filthy faces we turned up to meet it. It soon became a downpour, running down our collars and over our bodies, like a gift from Providence to friend and foe alike, making us all smile with a sense, however partial, of returning well-being. The soaking cloth of the uniforms on our tightly packed bodies clung to all of us, grey-green for the Germans, violet-brown for the Russians. We all grinned at each other without distinction, like players from 2 teams in the showers after a match. There was no longer any feeling of hatred or vengeance, only a sense of life preserved and overwhelming exhaustion. The rain became so heavy that we had to improvise shelter and covered our heads and shoulders with our ground sheets. Although hardly anyone understood more than a few words of the other language, we were all laughing and trading cigarettes, Hanover cigarettes for Machorka tobacco from the Tartar plain. We smoked and joked over nothing, a nothing which in fact represented the most absolute human joy I had ever known. The exchange of tobacco, the smoke under the ground sheets, which made us choke and cough, and the simple fact of laughter without reserve, all of this made a small island of joy in a sea of tragedy, which affected us like a shot of morphine. We were able to forget the hate which divided us as our stupefied senses reawakened to an awareness of life. Understanding nothing, I laughed uncontrollably as a curious sensation took hold of me and filled my veins. Suddenly I was covered with gooseflesh, as one is during a particularly moving piece of music. The rain was beating on the metal hood. Would we have to shoot our Russian fellow passengers tomorrow? That seemed impossible. It was impossible that such things could continue. We had just caught up with a regiment of motorized cavalry, stopped in the middle of nowhere. Streams of water were running down every exposed surface. The dull finish of the sidecars, sheltering under the dripping leaves of the trees at the edge of the woods, glistened with raindrops. Wesredo climbed down from his sidecar to talk to the cavalry commander. The fellows in the sidecars had long oilskins, which pretty well covered them and kept them more or less dry. However, all their camping equipment was in the trucks of the supply column, so instead of sleeping they had to spend their rest period tramping up and down through the puddles. Two fellows distributed food, a stale sausage for each German soldier and loaves of bread to be divided among 8. There was no food for the prisoners, whose rations in theory would be provided by the division. We thought of walking off a short way to devour our meagre portions, but we were bunched around our dripping communal plates. The Russians, who had nothing but their lives, kept their feverish eyes fixed on the food, which was impossible to hide. Finally, our torn and filthy hands broke the hard bread and held it out to the men who had been trying to kill us only a few hours before. Our stomachs were still rumbling with hunger 5 minutes later as we swallowed down the last mouthfuls of our rations. Everyone was thirsty, and our water bottles had been emptied after the fighting. Like feverish sheep, we needed water. We had obtained permission to leave the trucks to relieve ourselves, but for no other reason. We were in the middle of wild, uninhabited country, and there were no breakers or drinking troughs. However, the rain was still pouring down, and we collected the runoff from the backs of the trucks, the leaves, and the puddles in the oilcloths. When we had quenched our thirst, we left with the cavalry regiment. Finally, the rain stopped, leaving us chilled and bone-tired to the misery of our throbbing machines. Lightning was still streaking through the sky behind us and over our heads, and the thunder was still rumbling. Ahead, there were other flashes too, which unfortunately had nothing to do with the storm. These were produced by Stalin's organs, firing at the division blocked behind Konotop. As we drew nearer, we were able to gauge the size of the battle by the intensity of the fire flashing across the horizon. Soon, we also could hear the loud and continuous sound of guns. We had been hoping for a refuge where we could spend the night. Instead, we were faced with the anguish of a fresh hell and a fresh uncertainty of survival, as war tightened its vice-like grip once again around our throbbing temples. The young face of the blond boy who had played the harmonica a short time before hardened suddenly into the face of a man. Was it exhaustion, or did he simply want to get it over with? In the space of a few moments, he suddenly aged 20 years. We arrived at the town, which was black and deserted. Intermittent flashes from the battle being fought somewhere to the west of us, through the outer fringes of the town, lit the darkness. The thunder of explosions filled the air, shattering window panes and breaking off the gutters of the houses all around us. The rain had begun again, falling in small, delicate drops. We were ordered to leave the trucks and jumped down like sleepwalkers. The shock of contact with the ground reverberated through our numbed bodies, and we felt sickness rising in undulating waves along the entire length of our spinal columns. In a herd, we followed our leaders, while the trucks drove off to a nearby street. I could feel the staggered like an automaton after the sound of the boots of the fellow in front of me, without grasping that I was going back into battle. What happened that night at Konotop? I only know that there were explosions and fire and houses collapsing down the length of dark, indefinable back streets. There was a gutter full of running water, and there were my hard, heavy boots, which I scarcely had the strength to lift, and my big, bony feet inside them, which felt as if they were growing smaller and smaller, and the heat of my throbbing temples, which had begun to burn with fever, and the crushing fatigue which had settled around my thin shoulders, trapped in the filth of my undershirt and waterlogged tunic, and the tangle of leather straps and cartridge belts, heavy with ammunition, and the incomprehensible hostile world, whose weight we still had to bear, where we still had to march and crawl and tremble. Toward morning, which dawned as pale as the last morning of a condemned man, I was overwhelmed by a crushing sleep and briefly lost my waking nightmare. We collapsed in the shelter of an entranceway, which protected us from most of the rain, except when the wind blew a particularly strong gust. We spent a few hours there. Then we were wakened to stare at 100 other faces as white and drawn as our own. Our closest relatives would probably have hesitated before identifying us. My eyes, which felt as if they had sunk into my aching head, instinctively looked around to see what the new day would bring. Directly in front of the gate where we had slept was a building of several stories. Its grey walls were stained with long streaks which dribbled down from its gaping windows. A short distance to one side stood a cluster of miserable shacks, which now offered shelter only to a few wandering cats and troops looking for refuge. These buildings, which at their best could never have looked like much, now seemed soiled by the passage of something monstrous. Further along, the street was entirely blocked by the houses which had collapsed when the Russians had shelled the town the evening before. I looked for something that might produce an instant of pleasure and distract me for a moment from the effort of trying to control the spasmodic shivers which shook my whole body. A sound behind me made me turn my head. The veteran was coming back with 2 canteens of hot soup, which he had found God knows where. I watched him blankly as he limped through the puddles and the scattered rubble. His uniform was as grey and filthy as the setting, and his thin, shaggy face beneath his heavy steel helmet seemed to fit perfectly with everything else. Above our heads, the sky flowed slowly toward the horizon, trailing grey clouds like dirty rags, as far as the eye could see. "Anyone who wants to eat better, open his eyes," the veteran called, putting down the canteens. I quickly shook Howells, whose sleep, as always, seemed impenetrable. He jumped, but when he realized it wasn't a new bombardment or attack, he pulled himself together, muttering a few incomprehensible words, and finally stood up, rubbing his stiff and aching body. "God, I'm sick of this," he said in a disgusted, weary voice. "Where are we, and what the hell are we doing here?" "Come and eat," said the veteran. In silence, we devoured the millet and soup, which was already beginning to cool. Some of the fellows preferred to sleep a little longer. Then we were ordered out again. We were too exhausted. When we were forced to recognize an explosion or an airplane, we slid to the ground without haste. Then we got up again, and so on. I was certainly ill. My head and back ached, probably from exhaustion, and I was shaking with the cold shivers of fever. But there was nothing to do about it. If I felt any worse later, I would try to get sent to a hospital, but for that I would have to faint. We reached a section of the town that had suffered particularly heavy damage. In the ruins we could see an enormous tiger tank, which had ploughed a large furrow through the heaps of rubble and appeared to have been stopped by a mine, which had blown off its right tread. Despite this, it was otherwise intact, and its gun was still spitting occasional shells at the enemy formations, which were very close. Groups of soldiers hiding in the ruins seemed to be waiting for Ivan, who must have been digging in nearby. We moved carefully through the rubble to a hole where Hals and I settled down. For at least a half-mile ahead of us, and 500 yards behind us, we could see nothing but wreckage. Groaning with the effort, we piled up all the solid pieces of rubble we could move to keep ourselves off the bottom of the hole, which was covered with blackish water. We stared at each other in a kind of stupefied silence. We had already said everything there was to say under the circumstances. Our lives at that moment were reduced to waiting. The force of events had already inflicted enough horror to drive us mad. "You really look filthy," Hulls said finally. I'm sick, I said. We're all sick, Hulls answered, his eyes fixed on our universe of destruction. Our exhausted eyes met for a moment, and I saw on my friend's face an almost limitless depths of weariness and despair. I was also haunted by the thought of what might happen to us. It seemed literally impossible that this existence could go on much longer. We have been living in this way for over a year now, like gypsies, except that is far too mild a comparison. Even the poorest, most wretched gypsies lived better than we did. For over a year I had been watching my comrades die. Suddenly, all the memories of that year came flooding back. The Don, the Third International, Outkenny, the battalions of stragglers, Ernst, Tempelhof, Berlin, Magdeburg, the horrors of Belgorod, the retreat, and only yesterday Württemberg, his belly striped by a dozen streams of red blood which ran down to his boots. What stroke of fortune had saved me from those giant explosions? So many men had already been consumed right in front of my horrified eyes that I wondered if what I had seen could possibly have been true. What miracle had preserved Hulls, Lentzen, the veteran, and the other survivors of our ill-fated unit? Although our luck had been almost incredible and had spared us so far, it must almost surely run out if this went on much longer. Tomorrow, perhaps the veteran, or Hulls, or maybe even I, would be buried. I suddenly felt terribly afraid. I looked out as far as I could see, in all directions. It would probably be my turn soon. I would be killed, just like that, and no one would even notice. We had all grown used to just about everything, and I would be missed only until the next fellow got it, wiping out the memory of preceding tragedies. As my panic rose, my hands began to tremble. I knew how terrible people looked when they were dead. I'd seen plenty of fellows fall face down in a sea of mud and stay like that. The idea made me cold with horror. And my parents, I really should see them again. I couldn't just die like that. And Paula? My eyes filled with tears. Hulls was looking at me, as still as that horrible landscape, indifferent to suffering, death, everything. There was nothing we could do about it. The screams of fear, the groans of the dying, the torrents of blood soaking into the ground like a vile sacrilege. Nothing. Millions of men could... All it needed was an order from the authorities, and it would end, an order which the men would respect like a sacrament. And why? Because after all, the men were only human. I went on crying and muttering incoherently to my impassive companion. Hulls, I said, we've got to get out of here. I'm afraid. Hulls looked at me and then at the horizon. Get out? Where to? Go to sleep. You're sick. I looked back at him with sudden hate. He too was part of this indifference and inertia. The tank near us fired a shell, and the Russians sent back about half a dozen, scattering the piles of rubble a little further. Maybe they knocked off a few more of our fellows too, the veteran perhaps. Suddenly it all seemed unbearable. My trembling hands clutched my head as if they were trying to crush it, and I sank into total despair. My sobs attracted Halsey's attention. He looked at me, almost in irritation. Go to sleep, for God's sake. You can't go on like that. What difference does it make? You don't give a damn. Nobody gives a damn. Nobody gives a damn about anything. Nobody will give a damn when you tell anything. You're right. So what? So what? We've got to do something for the love of God, and not just sit here in a stupor the way you're doing now. Halsey's listless eyes were without expression. His feeling of misery was probably as great as mine, but for the moment it was dulled, and his listlessness had overcome his outrage. Go to sleep, I tell you. You're sick. No, I was shouting now. I'd rather be killed and get it over with, right now. I jumped up and left our hole, but before I had taken more than 2 steps, Hulls had grabbed me by the belt and pulled me back. Let go, Hulls, I shouted louder than ever. Let go, do you hear? You're going to shut up for God's sake and calm down and be quick about it. Hals clenched his teeth and clasped his two big hands around my neck. "You know as well as I do we're all going to get it, one after the other. So let the hell go of me. What business is it of yours anyway? What difference does it make?" "The difference is that I need to see your face from time to time, the way I need to see the veteran or that bastard Lindbergh. Do you hear? If you go on like this, I'll smash you on the head just to keep you quiet. But if Ivan gets me, I'll be dead anyway, and you won't be able to do a thing about it. If that happens, I'll cry, the way I did when my little brother Ludovic died. But he died because he was sick. He didn't do it on purpose. And if Ivan gets you, you won't have done it on purpose." A violent shiver engulfed my whole body. Tears continued to pour down my cheeks, and I felt like kissing my poor friend's filthy face. Hals loosened his grip and then let go. A burst of fire forced him to duck. He looked at me, and we both smiled. At the end of the day, our third attempt to move failed like the others. Streaked with white lights, which glimmered back at me from the insensible retinas of my companion, and we began another interminable night of fear, in a dark hole, with a pool of cold water under the stones, and an exhaustion so heavy one wished to die, a night in which nothing or everything could happen. There were fires, explosions, and short or long flashes of light, which killed the sleep pressing at the backs of our eyeballs. We listened to the cries of our fellow combatants and the lethal rain of rockets crashing into the ground behind us. 1,000 memories of my other life passed through my head. France and my youth, still so close and so remote, an act of childish naughtiness, a toy, a scolding, which now seemed so gentle, my mother and the new focus in my life, Paula. We hardly spoke during that night, but I knew that I should try to live for the sake of my friend. Long before daylight, a violent fit of shivering destroyed what was left of my resolution. In the grey daylight, Hals wrapped me in my cover, which I no longer had the will to unfasten. "Take this," he said, handing me a half-eaten can of food. "Eat it, you'll feel better." I looked despairingly at the jam mixed with lint and dust from the inside of the pack. "What is it?" "Eat it, it's good, you'll see." I did as I was told and scooped out the jam with 2 fingers. But before I'd swallowed even half of it, I was overwhelmed by nausea, and my vomit increased the filth of our refuge. "Damn it," Hals said. "You're much sicker than I thought. Try to sleep." Shaking with fever, I let myself fall into the mire, which I pushed back with my elbows and feet to try to make a flat place where I could stretch out and perhaps really sleep. Several hours passed before I regained consciousness. Later that morning, we were sent some reinforcements, and Hals was able to help me to another hole a little farther back, where 2 fellows put me on a makeshift bed laid across the shattered remnants of a ladder. 2 other fellows were lying on boards, which had been put directly onto the stones. Behind my head and my ears, ringing with fever, the war went on. I lay where I was, listening to its roar for an indefinable time, shaking with feverish chills, despite the pile of covers and coats which several well-meaning companions had thrown down on top of me. Once somebody woke me up and made me swallow a pill. How much time went by? Perhaps a day. I fought my fever while Russians and Germans fought each other through the outskirts of the town. After turning the end of the enemy lines to the east of Konotop, we withdrew to the west, only to find a defensive wall which cut us off from our rear. Several attempts to move out to the west failed, and our autonomous group, already weakened, was faced with the prospect of entrapment in a Bolshevik noose, which was drawing tight from the north, west, and south. While I lay shivering on my ladder, our situation grew extremely critical. Our staff officers were doing everything they could to kill the terrible rumour that we were encircled. The next night I was ordered to leave my ladder in a hurry and tottered on my unsteady legs to a more secure shelter in a cellar, where about 50 sick or wounded men had been collected. I was almost turned away from this improvised infirmary, but as I looked pretty sick, an orderly stuck a thermometer in my mouth. When this registered nearly 104 degrees, I was told to sit in a corner where I waited for morning and someone to look further into my case. Outside, the town was undergoing heavy bombardment simultaneously from the ground and from the air, and the orderlies were run off their feet by a flood of freshly wounded men. My comrades had gone back into the line to face the increasingly ferocious enemy assaults. Toward noon, the orderlies filled me with quinine and made me give my place to a fellow who was dripping with blood and no longer able to stand on his feet. With stars dancing in front of my eyes, I staggered from the dark cellar into brilliant sunshine. A final burst of summery sun lit a landscape of total devastation. Everywhere, columns of smoke were climbing into the sky. Groups of slightly wounded men stood staring and talking, visibly stricken with desperation and horror. One of them told me we were surrounded. This terrible news was almost as destructive as the bombardment. A sense of every man for himself had begun to spread, and our officers needed all the severity they could muster to prevent a hopeless rout. Still another day passed, and I slowly began to recover, but my head swam, like the head of a convalescent who has gotten up too quickly. I stayed huddled in a corner as long as I could, gleaning fragments of news from the rest of the city. Surrounded, dangerous situation. The Russians have already reached. We're trapped. The Luftwaffe is coming. But instead of our planes, we heard Yaks and I-15s throbbing overhead in the pale blue sky, and torrents of Russian bombs shaking what was left of the town. What exactly was happening? Almost no one really knew. I can still remember a roll call, and then the non-coms coming to comb the infirmary. A fellow had to be missing a foot at least to be able to stay behind. I was among those who could still be used, and was led back with several bandaged companions to a zone near the front of the fighting. In a vast space bordered by roofless houses, a new group was hastily organized. Among the 5 or 6 officers present, I immediately recognized Herr Hauptmann Wesreidau. From nearby to the northeast, the thunder of Stalin's organs drowned our voices and provoked a wave of panic which was difficult to control. I was still very sick. My mouth tasted sour, and I felt as if my thin, faltering body was supported only by my boots and my filthy clothes. Wesreidau began to speak, raising his voice to make himself heard above the noise of the guns. He would probably have preferred to give us a more detailed explanation, but the continuous uproar, the pressure of time, and the risk of Russian planes suddenly diving at our 3 companies drawn up in the square forced him to be brief. "Kameraden, we're surrounded. The entire division has been surrounded. We already knew it, but hearing it officially made us horribly afraid. A situation officially acknowledged to be dangerous by the staff must be very serious indeed." In the near distance, through the sound of explosions, we could hear the howl of Russian rockets. Both the earth and sky were filled with roaring noise, as if to emphasize the desperation of Captain Wesreidau's announcement. "We still have one hope," he went on, "a swift and brutal breakthrough by all our forces pressing at a single point. This point must be to the west, and we shall engage all our units at once. The success of this attempt depends on the courage of every one of us. There will only be one attempt, and it must be successful. There are some strong infantry units which will be going into action to help us on the other side of the Russian ring. If each one of us performs his duty, I feel confident that we shall break out of the Bolshevik. I know the quality of the German soldier. My friend saluted and requested us to get ready. Our companies were directed to the points from which they were to press our air assault. There were many wounded men around us, more deserving of a warm bed than of further battles, and fellows like me who were sick. The vast majority were utterly exhausted, staring with infinite weariness from glittering, feverish eyes. These were the troops Wesreidau had been exhorting to an excess of courage, valiant German soldiers who looked more like worn-out stock ready for the slaughterhouse. What provoked the sentiments of generosity which brought out the last cigarettes or the chocolates so rare they were usually devoured in secret. Inciting all the scum to fake friendship, leading the non-coms, who had probably been mixed up with every kind of dirt in civilian life, to pat a suspected possessor on the shoulder and talk of trust and faith, when they were really hinting for a bite, just like everyone else. Where did they come from, precisely when no one could use them? I was sick of the whole thing. My stomach was turning over, and I felt cold. I looked for Howells or some other friend, but couldn't see any familiar faces. They must all have been sent to a different position. For me, they had become almost like relatives, and their absence weighed on me. I felt very much alone among these mutilated men with their raging fevers, trying to find some excuse for hope and encouragement. I myself began to daydream about a soft bed with silk covers, imitating the veteran, who liked to dream aloud about beds like that, which he himself had never known. Even before the war, he'd been an unfortunate and unhappy man, but he knew how to dream. Sometimes, as his bony body lay stretched out on the hard ground, he smiled in a way which suggested such a powerful sense of well-being that I am sure, in those moments at least, he was unaware of the harshness of his situation, and that his dream was more powerful than reality. I myself was not yet that well trained, and my dreams could not obliterate the feverish vice which gripped my temples. Straight ahead, to the west, the smoke had climbed so high it blotted out the sky, and the distant horizon was ringed with fire. What substance could be feeding such a huge conflagration? Companies of men, black with dust and soot, were pouring back on the run. It seemed that our first contact with the Russians had not been in our favour. The retreating troops left a certain number of wounded with us, but no one knew what to do with them. The medical teams, which at best were inadequate, had already packed up and gone, or were about to leave. The wounded men were left lying in the street where they had been put down, trying to stanch the flood of their own blood, which was often pouring from several wounds at once. Everyone tried to help as much as possible, but we were capable only of ludicrous gestures. The most extraordinary scenes unfolded in front of our incredulous eyes. As we were sponging off a fellow who'd passed out, a fat Gefreiter came to help us, explaining that he'd just dropped a fellow with a smashed knee. "He was making too much noise, and I couldn't stand it. Give me someone who's knocked out any time." For the moment, our stretch of cleared street was not under bombardment. The battle was raging directly ahead, as well as to the northwest and southwest. Directly to the north, the Russian artillery was raking over the ruins like a monstrous plough. However, as a few of the retreating men huddled beside us, trying to catch their breaths, the Russian fire shifted and began to sweep through our position like a giant scythe. Our officers' orders were drowned by the shouts of the men and the uproar of a frantic stampede for shelter. Our jostling and cries for help and screams of panic were finally obliterated by explosions. Everyone who was able to had run off the street. The slightest protuberance offered some hope of survival, as a wall of fire passed over the 2,000 troops concentrated on that spot. The wounded, abandoned in the open, lay writhing in the dust. Through the uproar, we could hear the sound of disarticulated bodies falling back to the ground in broken pieces. As at Belgorod, the earth shook and everything trembled and grew dim, as the whole landscape suddenly became mobile. The filthy hands of ill and wounded men resigned to death scratched the ground for one last time, and the lined faces of veterans who believed they had already seen everything were transformed by desperate, imploring panic. Quite near us, behind a heap of tiles, a Russian shell scored a bullseye, exploding in the midst of 11 men who had huddled together like children caught in a sudden rain. The Russian shell landed in the precise centre of their trembling group, mixing flesh and bones and tiles in a torrent of blood. Chance, which continued to favour me, had driven me along with 3 companions to the shelter of a staircase in a roofless house. The building was hit on all sides during the bombardment, and the cellar filled with broken beams and other debris. However, thanks to our extraordinary helmets, our heads survived intact. When the thunder stopped for a moment, and we heard the screams of the newly wounded, we looked outside. The horror of what we saw was so overwhelming that we fell back, as if paralysed, onto the shaky stairs. God help us, someone shouted. There's nothing but blood. We've got to get away from here, screamed another voice, in a tone close to madness. He ran outside, and we followed him. The air was filled with bestial cries. Everyone who'd been lucky enough to survive was falling back to the west, where, as always, safety lay, and now the front, and the gap through which we would try to escape. Anyone who could still stand was helped. The wounded grabbed at the men running past. 2 haggard soldiers in front of me were dragging a third man through the dust, probably a friend who was nearly dead. How long had they pulled him along like that, and how long would it take them to dump him? I can no longer tell how long our stampede lasted, through the anonymous ruins and thick smoke and roaring guns. The Russians were firing at us from all sides, at close range, with 50mm guns. We staggered on, carrying the wounded as best we could. In complete disorder, we came to a railroad track strewn with the burnt-out wreckage of a train and a few Russian corpses. We trampled over them with a kind of fierce delight, taking our revenge for their artillery and their 50mm fire. The tracks ran through a kind of trench. We galloped down it, passing a second train as still and broken as the first. Some of our vehicles seemed to be parked there too, a crowd of soldiers and several Panzermänner. We ran right into a group of officers. Wes Radau, who had stayed with us throughout, was one of them. We were given a few minutes' rest, and everyone dropped where he stood. To the southwest, the din seemed to have increased tenfold and made my head swim. Then we received a fresh blow. Wes Radau and 2 of his aides ran through the groups of exhausted men. "Get up, get moving. We've got to push on now. The division has broken through. If you don't hurry, we'll be caught in the trap, so get the hell up. We're the last ones left." Already, men half dead with exhaustion were staggering to their feet. The non-coms tapped on the shoulders of the stronger men, who were trying to help the wounded comrades they had carried out of town, and told them not to bother any more. "Don't load yourself with anyone who can't walk. You'll need all the strength you've got just to make it yourself." And so we were forced to abandon a great many men to an almost inconceivably horrible fate, despite their desperate pleas for help. Half paralyzed by terror and fear, men who had lost almost all their blood managed to get up and even hide their pain so that they would be allowed to walk beside the healthy. The heroism, pathos, and determination of our breakout exceed by far my powers of description. Men who had always been cowards became heroes despite themselves. A great many managed to cover barely half the distance. We fought our way through the fires of hell, losing almost half of our remaining men, as we pushed for more than 9 hours, from shell hole to shell hole, along the famous and tragic Konotop-Kiev road, past burnt-out tanks and piles of hundreds of shriveled corpses. You who perhaps will someday read these lines may also remember that one evening in the autumn of 1943, the bulletins announced that German troops caught in Konotop had managed to break out of a Russian trap. This was true. Of course, the price was never mentioned because it didn't matter. For you, the day of deliverance was coming. The rain blew in from the horizon in waves. Occasionally, a brief moment of light enabled us to spot the next undulating curtain of water sweeping across the streaming steppe. It had rained steadily for 2 days, and despite the discomfort and inconvenience, we hoped the rain would last for at least that long again. In another 2 days, if we could maintain our rate of 30 miles a day and had any luck at all, we should reach the Dnieper. No planes could fly through such a torrential downpour, so there had been no yaks, and every day without yaks was a reprieve from death for hundreds of men. The extraordinary mobility of the Wehrmacht, one of its principal sources of strength up to that moment, had entirely disappeared in that part of Russia, and the men from Army Group Centre were plodding toward the river in interminable columns at the rate of 3 miles an hour. Our mobility, which had always given us an advantage over the vast but slow Soviet formations, was now only a memory, and the disproportion of numbers made even flight a doubtful prospect. Moreover, the equipment of the Red Army was constantly improving, and we often found ourselves pitted against extremely mobile motorized regiments of fresh troops. To complete our disarray, the Soviet troops that had been tied up in the attempt to trap us at Konotop were now free to pursue our slow withdrawal. German aviation, which was entirely occupied south of Cherkasy, had abandoned our part of the sky to the Yaks, which took advantage of this freedom to harass us unmercifully. So, despite our heavy, waterlogged clothes, worn-out boots, fever, and the impossibility of lying down except on the soaking ground, we blessed fortune for sending us grey skies and rain. During the morning, 5 Bolshevik planes had appeared despite the weather. Our harassed men reacted with an automatic impulse of self-defense and self-preservation, staring desperately at the flat plain for somewhere to hide. But, like animals caught in a trap, we understood there was no way out. The companies in a direct line of fire dropped to one knee, in the regulation position for anti-aircraft defense. These companies received the Yaks fire and saw several men torn to pieces by Russian bullets, but managed to bring down one of the planes. It was our bad luck that the plane went into a spin and fell directly onto our convoy, crushing a truck full of wounded men and opening a crater 20 yards wide filled with shattered flesh. No one cried out. In fact, almost no one looked. We simply picked up our burdens and went on. We were all too exhausted to react, and almost nothing stirred our emotions. We had all seen too much. In my sick and aching brain, life had lost its importance and meaning, and seemed of no more consequence than the power of motion one lends to a marionette, so that it can agitate for a few seconds. Of course, there was friendship. There were Hals and Paula, but immediately behind them was that hole full of guts, red, yellow, and foul-smelling. Piles of guts, almost as large as the earth itself. Life could be snuffed out like that, in an instant, but the guts remained for a long time, stamped on the memory. We walked without stopping. The interminable line of men ahead curved in a semicircle which seemed to be standing still. The Dnieper was not yet in sight. We had planned to reach it in 5 days, but we were now in the 6th, ploughing through the mud at an average speed of 2 or 2.5 miles an hour. I had never seen a countryside so huge and so empty. The trucks and other vehicles that had gas had all passed us long ago. The rest were pulled by the few half-starved nags we had not already killed and eaten. From time to time, someone gave up his place on a crowded steiner, pulled by 2 horses, to continue on foot. We were under orders not to abandon materiel for any reason whatever. We were supposed to receive more gasoline, God knows how, probably by air, so that we could continue to drive our machines. In fact, one morning we did receive a delivery from aircraft. 2 Ju-52s threw down 8 large packages of rope, which we retrieved with derision. We were supposed to use them for tying our vehicles to the tanks which had been destroyed at Konotop the week before. In default of gas, our gaunt horses stubbornly pulled our vehicles through the gluey muck, which had been freshly trampled by 30 retreating regiments. Our steiner, on which I had hung all my gear, was pulled by 2 Rhenish horses, probably taken from their peacetime labour about a year before. One of them was covered with sores, and his eyes glittered with fever. 2 days later, on the bank of the Dnieper, our brave horse received his reward. A non-com from the cavalry shot him in the head, along with some 10 others. Very few horses were allowed onto the pontoons, whose capacity was inadequate even for the men, and nothing could be left behind which might be useful to the Russians. In a way, this was the beginning of our scorched earth policy. The proportion of sick men to healthy rose at an alarming rate. A healthy mind in a healthy body was the slogan our leaders had held up to us. Under the conditions of our retreat, it was often hard to tell which was affected first, mind or body. It seemed that well over half our men had nothing healthy about them. Luckily, the weather remained frightful. This was particularly hard on the sick and feverish, undernourished, dehydrated men with filthy, suppurating wounds and bodies barely covered by torn, ragged uniforms. But anything the weather could produce, wind, rain, heavy clouds trailing down to the ground, was preferable to clear skies, which invariably meant the humming planes diving down at us like carrion crows attacking a moribund animal. Indifferent to everything, we continued our slow march. 2 or 3 times a day, covering troops were organised and left behind to slow down the enemy, who were following at a leisurely pace. The men chosen for this task dug shallow holes which protected less than a quarter of. Their bodies and waited, resigned, for the juggernaut to crush them. We knew that we would never see them again. In other districts, entire regiments had been wiped out by Russian armoured troops which had caught up with them. The retreat was costly and reached its climax on the east bank of the river, in an incredible crush of men and materiel spread out over acres of flat sand, so that each Russian missile was assured a maximum destructive effect. A healthy mind in a healthy body would have done everything possible to escape those circumstances. Our eyes, which had grown used to accepting everything without surprise, gaped at the most astonishing sights. Everyone reached the river, the outer boundary of safety, in a state of indescribable panic, only to find it necessary to trample on the men already there, even drown them, to have any hope of getting onto the wretchedly inadequate vessels, which often foundered before they reached the other side. On the 8th day, after skirting a broad hill, we reached the bank of the river, or more precisely, the swarm of lancer who covered the bank, hiding it completely. Through the noise and confusion we could hear the sound of engines, which we found curiously reassuring. Working engines must mean there was gasoline somewhere. We knew that motorized transport was essential for such a huge country, and that even with motors we could only move very slowly because of the terrible roads. However, if we heard engines, it must at least mean that some reorganization had begun. Among the crowd of men there were many vehicles which had been dragged as far as the river, despite almost insuperable obstacles, and were waiting in the long grass, which looked like dune grass. In fact, the engines we heard did not belong to refueled trucks, but to the boats, inadequate in size and number, which the engineers were using to move across as many men and machines as they could. Whenever materiel could be moved, it was given priority. Loading trucks and guns and light tanks onto vessels built to carry hay carts was not easy, but fortunately we had plenty of manpower to replace the cranes and derricks of a port, at least 100,000 at our point of arrival alone. I saw men standing up to their necks in water, supporting makeshift landing stages until the water rose over their chins, rickety, hastily improvised piers which collapsed as soon as their human props moved away. Half drowned, these men worked frantically against time, with extraordinary persistence and patience. The urgent task of transporting 5 divisions was not begun until 2 days after our arrival, when all materiel that could be moved was across the river. We had 10 boats at our disposal, each with a maximum capacity of 20 men. 4 barges which had run out of gas and were towed in turn by 2 small boats equipped with BMW portable engines, and 4 precarious pontoons, each with a capacity of 150 men. At this point, south of Kiev, the Dnieper is about 800 yards wide. Had we chosen a section to the north of the city, we would have been in rich, densely populated country, where we would undoubtedly have been able to acquire plenty of boats for crossing, and where, in addition, the river often narrows to less than 100 yards. There were also bridges in Kiev itself. Some had undoubtedly been destroyed, but others must have been standing. By the evening of the 3rd day after our arrival at the river, at least 10,000 men had crossed to the west bank. First of all, the sick and wounded were taken, and I witnessed many instances of lightly wounded or sick men giving up their places to the more seriously injured. Although the rain was remorseless and savage, and we were all sickened by our diet of horse meat, often raw, we nonetheless made use of this forced delay to rest as much as we could. During the night of our 3rd or 4th day, everything turned hellish again. As we had feared, we heard the roar of war again as soon as the rain stopped, dull and unclear at first, and then unmistakable, the rumble of tanks moving slowly through the mud. To begin with, there was only the noise, which in itself was enough to send a wave of terror through the 85,000 men trapped beside the water. On the slopes littered with exhausted soldiers, thousands of men lifted their heads to verify the terrifying sound. We stared through the darkness, trying to see the unseeable, frozen for a minute, with our heads lifted to listen. Then everywhere, shadowy figures began to move, with frantic, intensifying speed. Tanks! Every man grabbed his things and began to run toward what we knew was an insuperable barrier, hoping that the boats were still moving, and that somehow they would be able to take all of us at once. We were packed in a dense crowd onto a narrow strip of ground beside the river, and the sound of our shouting voices rose above the heavy rumble of tanks which now filled the night. Frantic men were abandoning everything on the bank and plunging into the water to try to swim to the opposite shore. Thousands of voices were shouting toward the grey water and the opposite bank, where they hoped they would at last be able to rest. Men waded out into the icy water until they lost their footing, and the sound of voices pleading and calling for help rose to such a pitch that the boats still operating hesitated to draw into shore for fear of being swamped. Madness seemed to be spreading like wildfire. Almost unconscious with exhaustion, I sat through about 20 minutes of panic with 5 or 6 other soldiers, collapsed onto a heap of packs which had been abandoned on the wet grass, letting the howling mob and the rush of events pass us by. Here and there we could see other small groups like ours, moving only when the frantic stampede swept them along. The officers, who had managed to keep some self-control, organised a few more or less conscious men and ran to meet the mob, trying to stop them like shepherds trying to control a herd of crazed sheep. They were able to reorganise a few groups, which they posted on the slopes of the hills to attempt interception of the Soviet tanks, should they come that way. Our dense crowd of men stretched down the riverbank as thinly as possible to offer fewer opportunities for mass destruction by the T-34S, which appeared about an hour and a half later. Fortunately, there were not many tanks, and they didn't linger, as their real objective was Kiev, where heavy fighting was in progress. I stayed where I was, sitting on a heap of packs with a few strays, when we heard that a raft made of tyres taken from the trucks parked nearby could carry a certain number of Lancer across to the west bank. We ran several hundred yards upstream and saw a tight cluster of men beside the dark water. We quickly went over to them. There must have been about 100 men wading in the mud. In the centre of the group, about a dozen fellows were busily taking out the inner tubes of a heap of tyres and tying them together to make a raft, which would clearly never be large enough to hold everyone. We were greeted with unwelcoming stares and given no encouragement to stay. Finally, a big fellow who was standing and watching the work spoke to us. "You can see that this thing won't even take half the men here. Go on a little further. You'll be sure to find something." He must have said more or less the same thing several times over to the fellows who had arrived ahead of us, but most of them had stayed, hoping to get onto the raft somehow, even to fight their way on if necessary. I had neither the build nor the strength to force my way onto a contraption that would probably sink anyway. So, despite the distant rumble that came to us in spurts on the wind, I went on up the river, accompanied by 2 stray artillerymen. We walked through a damp, heavy fog, between clumps of dripping firs, past groups of frantic, terrified men pacing up and down the interminable bank. The fog grew steadily thicker until it blotted out the countryside completely, turning us into Chinese shadow puppets. We could no longer tell which way we were going, and were gripped by continual anxiety that we were walking in the wrong direction. Luckily, from time to time, someone would check on the position of the river and shout out into the darkness, "Ach Gott, das Wasser ist da!" We went on without thinking, unaware that if we followed the river long enough, we would arrive at Kiev, which was the heart of the fighting. No one seemed capable of any logical, connected thought, but the constant fear, exhaustion, and threat of tanks kept us moving, trying to get away. It didn't really matter where we might get to, or how, just away. The darkness of the night was continually broken by flares and the noise of guns. A group of men passed by, invisible but quite close, judging by the sound of their voices. "Achtung! Ivans! Achtung!" I looked imploringly at the artilleryman, who had been stumbling along beside me for more than half an hour, but received nothing except the fixed stare of a hunted animal. We no longer understood anything. We had thought the Russians were on our right, behind the hills, but the firing was coming from the riverbank, which was on our left. Expecting the Russians to begin shooting at us at any minute, we began to run, looking for some hole or hollow where we could hide. Once we had flattened ourselves down into what seemed to be a shallow frog pond, we tried to grasp the facts of our situation. A non-com in our group thought the Popovs must be patrolling in boats, knocking off Germans whenever they could. To judge by the lights of the explosions, which were sometimes hundreds of yards apart, there must have been several Russian boats. The darkness that hid our trapped men rang with the sounds of our frantic disorder. Shells were coming in from the west, landing somewhere to the east of us, beyond the hills. This comforted us somewhat. Since the shells were falling beyond the hills, they must be landing on the Russians, and our men must be firing them. The artilleryman remarked in a pleased and knowing voice, "Those are ours, all right. I'd know that yap anywhere." "I never thought we'd get any help," said a soldier who had just joined us. In the end, the shelling lasted only 10 minutes and probably had very little effect, as there was no effort to aim it with any precision. The fog had grown so thick that the glow of the discharges of the 77s was almost invisible, emerging from the darkness and vanishing again, as if we were watching through a thin, semi-transparent cloth. But although the fog was thicker, the air had also grown astonishingly cold, stabbing our lungs every time we took a breath. "My God, it's cold," someone said. The temperature of the water, which came to the middle of our boots, must have been close to freezing. Despite their remarkable resistance to water, our boots had at last become waterlogged, and our feet felt frozen. "We can't keep on like this," said the artilleryman, almost laughing. "We've got to get out of here, or we'll catch our death. Anyway, why should we be afraid of our own guns?" My boots each seemed to weigh a ton of dense, solid matter, which was, in fact, something like 95% water. The exhaustion we had been dragging about with us for days increased the fear we could no longer control. Fear intensified our exhaustion, as it required constant vigilance. We had learned to see in the dark, like cats, but on that particular night no look, however penetrating, could pierce the fog, which was as thick as a London pea souper. I could no longer breathe through my clogged nose, and only drew in through my pursed lips the bare minimum necessary to sustain life. We seemed to be moving through a mixture of water and sulphur, and each icy breath stabbed me with hundreds of sharp points, all the way down to my empty stomach. I remembered the veteran's advice, but couldn't think of anything convincingly warm or dry, so I began deliberately to recollect pleasant things that had happened to me, that I might have experienced a long time ago. But this proved almost impossibly difficult. My mind filled only with unpleasant memories. The hunched back of the soldier in front of me could not be transformed into the back of my mother, busy with some household task on a long winter evening, or my brother's back, or the back of anyone I had ever known in peacetime. All I saw was a silhouette of the history of the war and Russia, which memories of youth could not blot out. It seemed as if the war would mark men for life. They might forget women or money or how to be happy, but they would never forget the war, which spoiled everything, even the joy which was bound to come, like the victory ahead. The laughter of men who lived through the war has something forced and desperate about it. It does them no good to say that they must now make use of the experience. Their mechanisms have been run too hard, and something has gone out of balance. Laughter no longer has any more value for them than tears. The back of the soldier in front of me filled me with pity and respect, and even exasperation. I felt like hitting him until he fell, so that he would be on a level with the war. But if that man fell, there would be another right after him, and then thousands more after that. Thousands of hunched backs swollen by acid fog. Russia is still full of backs like that, the hunched backs of men who have forgotten how to dream, and it will take more toil and war before they all have been toppled. The roar of the guns was growing louder, like the noise of an oncoming train, and there was the sound of machine guns too, although we still couldn't see anything. We could also hear a vast din of human voices which rose above the thunder of guns and machinery. We stopped where we were, a light trace of breath escaping from each half-open mouth. I looked for some explanation on the filthy faces of my companions, but their expressions were as bewildered as my own, which had probably not changed much since I had begun to try to lose myself in memories. Since surprises in wartime can only be dangerous, we immediately looked for a hole. All I could find was the riverbank. I slid over the edge until I was up to my thighs in the invisible water, which seemed almost warm after the icy air. I immediately lost hold of my attempted daydream and stared feverishly through the black and impenetrable wall which hid the action from us like a curtain in the theatre. The roar of the tanks grew louder and made the surface of the water tremble, with a motion I was just able to perceive. When danger finally comes, after hours of harassing fear, it is almost like a liberation. At least one knows what the confrontation will be, and if the danger is terrible, one knows that at least it will soon be over. But when danger continues indefinitely, it becomes unbearable. Then even an outburst of tears is no release. After hours and then days of danger, as at Belgorod, one collapses into unbearable madness, and a crisis of nerves and tears is only the beginning. Finally, one vomits and collapses, entirely brutalized and inert. Death had already won. I was already over my knees in the water. The fog hid the terrifying breadth of the river from me, and I thought that if the worst came to the worst, I could always try that way out, skimming over the surface like a will-o'-the-wisp. I felt almost convinced that I could do it. Then we saw lights and heard explosions like grenades and crackling sounds, accompanied by little points of light. 5 or 6 gasping soldiers splashed into the water beside me. "It's those dumb bastards in the artillery who brought Ivan here." Terrifying screams drowned the sound of engines, screams so prolonged and horrible that my blood froze, and the water around my legs seemed even colder than before. "Mein Gott!" someone murmured in the darkness beside me. We heard the sounds of gunfire and explosions coming closer, punctuated by blood-curdling screams. Men suddenly plunged out of the pale, enveloping cotton and disappeared like ghosts into the black water. From the sounds of splashing, we guessed they were trying to swim. We felt petrified by fear and stayed where we were. A terrible, growling mass of machines passed by close to us, shaking the earth and water, and a penetrating headlight pierced the fog. We couldn't see where it was going, only that it was moving. During those moments of terror, we clung to each other like children. A piece of the bank broke away under our weight, and our heap of belongings slid into the mud. My head went under for a few seconds, and when I surfaced, the riverbank and the long grasses hid what was happening. We could hear the sound of machine guns ripping into the air very close to us, over the grinding roar of tank treads, and always terrifying screams as the tanks drove a bloody furrow through the tightly packed crowd paralyzed by terror and darkness. A little higher up, 2 other lights, barely visible in the gloom, were seeking out other victims. With daylight, we saw that there must have been about 10 tanks passing through without stopping on their way to Kiev. However, our tension was so great that we stayed in the water for a long time, without moving, despite the stinking mud which had seeped into our helmets and through our hair, which was standing on end with terror. With absolute accuracy, the German guns, firing from the other side of the river, had drawn the Bolshevik tanks onto us and contributed to the horrible deaths of many of our men. Cries for help drew us from our slimy refuge, and we ran to do what we could to help the dying, which was very little. We saw sights so horrible they were beyond any imagining. We shot a great many men to put them out of their misery, although mercy killings were strictly forbidden. At dawn, the fog lifted, and an almost spring-like sun ushered in a new day of difficulties and disappointments. Burial squads were forcibly organized and began their grisly work, grimacing with horror. Everyone who managed to escape this duty went off as far as he could, to try to sleep or warm up. My partly dried clothes had gone stiff, and I felt uncomfortable and ill. But my exhaustion, which weighed on my eyes and made the sunlight unbearable, prevented me from grasping that I should have stripped and washed in the river, allowing the sun to nourish my exhausted body. I stayed as I was, immobilized by my need for sleep, staring through half-closed eyes at the damp grey-green of my uniform, turning slowly yellow as it dried. When I finally did sleep, I was awakened almost immediately by shouts of terror. I opened my eyes and stared up into an infinite pale blue sky, in which there was a familiar noise: planes. My bones creaked as I propped myself up on one elbow. I couldn't see anything unusual, only the piles of sleeping bodies among the gorse. Everywhere, faces drowning in sleep were turning to the sky. A fellow in a fatigue cap ran by, shouting like a deaf man. A heavy machine gun behind me opened fire. It took us a while to shake off our torpor. 4 Russian planes were circling like hornets about 3,000 feet above us. Everyone was shouting, both men and officers. "Do you all want to be killed?" a ragged lieutenant was yelling at us. "You should at least try to defend yourselves." We feverishly grabbed our guns and waited with one knee on the ground for the enemy, who was about to drop from the clouds. However, the yaks went away. It was inconceivable that they should have been afraid of us, so we concluded they were running out of gas. We rubbed our eyes and sighed with relief as our partially revived sense of vigilance died down. Everyone was thinking of stretching out again and catching up with his lost sleep. Then the heavy machine gun pivoted rapidly on its mount and began to fire toward the north. Everyone turned that way too, before throwing himself flat. The 4 planes roared over us almost at ground level, firing rapidly with all their guns. We could just hear the lieutenant, who was very near us, shouting as loud as he could to make himself heard above the noise of the planes. "Fire, you bastards!" The planes passed overhead. I saw the lieutenant roll onto the ground, stand up again, and with one hand clutching his stomach, fire his revolver at the roaring planes. Then he grimaced, fell to his knees, and rolled over onto himself. Of all the men around us, he was the only one who had been hit. The planes had reserved most of their fire for the overloaded, almost motionless rafts, which made perfect targets. "Give us some help!" shouted a fellow with a long, thin face, who'd gone with a companion to see what he could do for the lieutenant. Why in God's name did he stand up? "He was acting like a hero," answered one of the Felds, "and he was the only one. We should all be ashamed." The thin-faced fellow was helping to carry the dying man down to the river's edge. I was behind him with some of the lieutenant's things. "Shame has nothing to do with it," he said, sighing heavily. We had not been abandoned. From the west bank, our anti-aircraft guns were firing on the Russian vultures overhead, and the 2 ramshackle rafts on the river were continuing their dangerous journey. There must have been many dead and wounded men on board, to judge by the agitation we could all see. The planes dived down towards the swarming strip of ground, which rang with screams of pain and cries for help, and toward the rafts, achieving a hideous massacre. Every time the danger withdrew for a moment, allowing us to lift our heads and look out over the reeds, we saw scenes of tragedy. Almost everyone on the rafts who hadn't been killed or immobilized by wounds had jumped into the water and was trying to swim. The planes made a 4th pass and were met this time by all our guns and Spandaus, which finally drove them away. We heard a loud sound of shooting. One of the Russian planes had been hit and was spiraling upward, trying to gain height, leaving a thick plume of black smoke behind it. Suddenly it lurched into an irrevocable dive toward the water. We saw a smaller shape detach from the mass of the plane, probably the pilot, trying to jump to safety. But his parachute, if he had one, failed to open. Man and machine hit the water at the same speed and disintegrated. For a moment our cheers drowned the groans of the wounded on the rafts. However, toward noon the Russian planes were back again, about a dozen fighter bombers this time. In the interval we had deepened our holes so that we were better protected, but we couldn't reach the planes with our fire. The Russians, as before, attacked the heavily loaded rafts on the river, which had almost reached the west bank. Our flak tried unsuccessfully to keep the planes away, and we watched, pale with helpless rage, as the bombs fell toward the water. A raft and all its human cargo were blown to pieces. Our fleet was being liquidated, and the attacks were just beginning. The Aleutians were gaining height to dive down again. A soldier beside me was weeping and shouting over and over, "The bastards! The bastards!" Our damp hands scraped nervously against the ground as we manoeuvred our guns. "We'll never get out of this," shouted my companion. "They'll wipe us out, the shits." Then a miracle occurred, which completely changed the tone of our cries. "Sieg! Sieg! Der Luftwaffe!" 9 Messerschmitt 109Fs had appeared and were diving down onto the Russian planes, which had just completed an attack formation. The Russian pilots, aware of the technical inferiority of their planes, were trying to get away as fast as they could. We could hear bursts of fire and felt a surge of intense, savage and vengeful joy when we saw 2 of the Ilyushins spinning through the air like partridges hit by hunters' bullets. Then our cries grew even louder. 5 Russian planes passed right overhead before we realized they meant danger. We shook our fists at them. The fellow beside me, who'd been trembling with fury a moment before, was now trembling with joy, as uncontrolled as a madman. Our fighters were chasing the Ilyushins, which fled, skimming low over the ground. Then the pack disappeared behind the hills, which blocked our view. We heard guns and a loud explosion. After that, we had nothing to do but tend the wounded. The next day we felt almost happy to wake in the rain. Traffic across the river had continued all night, carrying over as many men as possible. Nevertheless, a vast number were still waiting on the east bank. We no longer knew how many days we'd been there, but despite all our difficulties, we'd been able to reorganize somewhat. Men belonging to the same units had sorted each other out and waited in distinct groups. Our officers had posted armed men on the hills to warn against a sudden attack. We knew that the Russians were very close and felt rather surprised that they hadn't attacked already. Probably the battle for Kiev had absorbed almost all of them. I had joined a large group of men made up for the most part of members of the Grossdeutschland, and men who had escaped from the infantry regiment which had come to our aid when we broke through at Konotop. The officers present, among whom I was delighted to see Herr Hauptmann Wesredau, told us that as members of an elite division and as specialized offensive troops, we should have been among the first to embark for the West. They also said that we would be the next to go. Naturally, we were glad to hear it, as everyone wished to reach the West Bank as quickly as possible. Some fellows suggested a technique that had occurred to many of us as soon as we arrived at the river. This was to tie together bunches of reeds with our belts and use them as floats. This had been proved successful many times, but it was not possible for moving the equipment indispensable to any soldier who did not wish to be considered a deserter. The reception of these unequipped men on the other bank must have been sufficiently poor for our officers to forbid escape by reed float. But it was difficult for them to impose discipline on men simultaneously paralyzed by fear and prepared to affront the devil. Many men, in fact, drowned or died of pneumonia, and many, after risking everything, were court-martialed. I no longer had any clear idea of our situation, and set about trying to discover from the soldiers in my unit what had happened to my friends. Perhaps someone among these 3,000 men waiting in the mud had run into Hals or Lenson or the veteran, stretched out on an armful of long soaking stalks, dreaming of a distant utopia, indifferent to the rain running down his resigned features. But my researches were in vain, and my questions remained unanswered. Once I thought I recognized a couple of faces from our disbanded company. I talked to the fellows, who answered evasively that they no longer remembered anything that had happened. They were absolutely exhausted, and my questions only seemed to annoy them. Their stunned minds seemed capable of only one idea: they had to cross the river. There was only one person who might know a little more than the others, Herr Kapitän Wesredau. But the respect and fear which officers required of us made it almost impossible to speak to them. A few of the older soldiers were bold enough to approach them, but for a boy like myself it was entirely different. However, I was so consumed by desire to speak to the captain that it must have showed on my face. Also, I was always lingering somewhere near him or his group. I was sitting on my bundle a short distance away from Wesredau and 2 or 3 other officers, including a major, when Wesredau began to walk toward me. I stared in confusion at the tall figure in the long leather coat shining with rain, ready to leap to my feet and snap to attention. But the captain gestured to me to stay as I was, so I remained on the ground, with my eyes glued to his face. He seemed even taller than usual because I was so low down. "What regiment do you belong to, young fellow?" he asked. I stammered out my regimental number, as well as the number of the scratch company I was taken into for the retreat from Konotop. He took me for a check, so I explained my origins to him. Was all he said about that. Those scratch companies were the last ones out. I led several of them myself. "I know, Herr Hauptmann," I said, blushing. "I saw you." I couldn't get used to the idea that the captain really was talking to me. "Ah," said Wesriedau. "Then we have memories in common of a difficult time." "Ja, Herr Hauptmann." He reached for a cigarette, but the packet was empty. Had he perhaps been going to offer me one? "We'll be crossing tomorrow, young fellow, and I expect you'll be getting a long leave." The word leave was like a sudden sip of champagne. "Leave? I think so. We won't have stolen it from you." Sensations which I had thought I would never feel again immediately revived, all the emotions I had buried with so much difficulty. Could it be possible? But it had always been possible. How could I doubt it? I suddenly realized the full weight of my despair, how absolutely I had given up hope. Now I began to think again, timidly and gently, of Paula. Since we had been organized into the special assault group, there had been no mail. Although we had been moving continuously, this lack of news had weighed on me terribly. And then, in the face of such intense misery and disgust, words describing love and tenderness lost their meaning. Everything I had felt seemed to have been swept away in the dust and noise of crumbling houses, and in misery far more intense than the miseries of love. I had often thought that if I managed to live through the war, I wouldn't expect too much of life. How could one resent disappointment in love if life itself was constantly in doubt? Since Belgorod, terror had overturned all my preconceptions, and the pace of life had been so intense one no longer knew what elements of ordinary life to abandon in order to maintain some semblance of balance. I was still unresigned to the idea of death, but I had already sworn to myself during moments of intense fear that I would exchange anything, fortune, love, even a limb, if I could simply survive. I sensed that Captain Wesriedau was about to leave, so I asked him if he knew anything of my usual companions. He was only able to remember the veteran, calling him by his proper name. August Wiener's company was supporting a howitzer battery at the beginning of the offensive. The first troops had a hard time. It was very difficult. In any case, the men who got through were probably sent to Kiev. That's where we would have regrouped if we'd had the trucks. I listened to him in silence. He nodded and walked away. "We'll be crossing tomorrow." My head was spinning with the thought of a leave, and with the anguish of the possible loss of my special comrades. Perhaps I had already walked past their burnt bodies on the shattered pavement of the Konotop-Kiev road. Would I also have to renounce the friendships which had seen me through so much? I knew that they also were so close to being stripped of everything that the sentiment I had for them seemed permissible. It was so gratuitous and disinterested. Must I also obliterate, without remorse, for remorse is a dangerous luxury in battle, the memories of Hals and Lenson, and even that bastard Lindbergh? However, if my friends had disappeared, the veteran had left me an inheritance, a special faculty. I would relive all my good memories, even in the worst moments, and lie on the ground, inert and almost insensible, oblivious of the rain which my saturated cap was no longer able to soak up, and which ran over my face and collar and down my neck. The rain streaming across my cheeks would take the place of the tears I should have shed. The rain continued for a long time, through the night and the next day, until the end of the afternoon. The soil on which we waited had become a giant sponge. Each fresh bundle of rushes soaked up as much water from the ground as it received from the sky. We were so thoroughly soaked through that some of us stripped altogether to wait naked. Most of the time we stayed on our feet, with tent cloths over our shoulders, watching the endless back and forth of the rafts. Toward noon, despite the terrible weather, a squadron of Ilyushins appeared. Once again we cursed those birds of ill omen, which forced us to lie with our noses in the gluey Dnieper mud. The planes made 3 passes, scattering bombs and bullets wherever they could see anything. Once again we were filled with a panic which ended only when the list of killed and wounded had grown a little longer. Finally, towards 6 in the evening, as the light was fading, our group was taken in charge by the transit services. We were ordered to collect our things and proceed in good order to the 3 embarkation points which the incessant trampling had transformed into an astonishing quagmire. Carrying our arms and baggage, covered with slimy mire, we set off down the road despite the mud which threatened to engulf us. With heroic patience and discipline, each man waited his turn, enduring the torrential rain without complaint. With our feet in the muddy water, our boots could no longer resist. We kept our assigned places. The last men to embark had to wait for several hours. Vague, momentary smiles lit our almost unrecognizable faces. At last we were going to cross, and all of this would be over. We would be able to dry ourselves and sleep, perhaps even in comfort, and stop feeling afraid. We clung to our more hopeful thoughts, although we were haunted by one last fear. What would happen on the trip across? Would the overused, overloaded boats make it? Or would they sink, carrying 100 desperate souls to the bottom? And then there were the Yabos. If any Russian planes appeared, we could all remember in clear detail the horrible massacre of the day before. Then it grew dark. Russian planes rarely flew at night, so perhaps we were at least safe from them. When it was my turn, I climbed with 100 other men onto a raft whose planks had been splintered by the passage of thousands of hobnailed boots. I watched anxiously as the water rose to within a foot of swamping us. "That's enough, Captain!" shouted a non-com who looked about 40 years old. "Do you want us to sink?" "As many as possible, Herr Spiess," an engineer said, laughing. "That's orders, and we're used to it. Come on, let's have another turn." When we were on the point of foundering, the boatmen let go of the ropes and, with the agility of young goats, jumped forward. Our balance seemed so precarious that no one dared move. The cursed bank, veiled in fog, disappeared from sight. I was huddled in the centre of the raft between 2 fellows I didn't know. A young lieutenant from an infantry regiment which had come to help us at Konotop, and a fellow from my own company who seemed to be asleep on his feet. He was the only one who seemed so indifferent. Everyone else was listening and looking intently, especially toward the rainy sky, which we mistrusted absolutely. A boat half the size of ours, but with the same engine, slowly pulled level with us. Its deck was as jammed as ours. How long was the crossing? Perhaps a quarter of an hour. It seemed interminable. The water slid past us with an easy, regular motion, whose slowness made us frantic. Some of the fellows were counting aloud, marking off the seconds perhaps, or using them as one uses imaginary sheep to force sleep. Then voices announced the approach of the West Bank and safety and release from our torments. The men at the front of the raft could see it, enveloped in fog. Our blood ran faster in our veins as we tried by willpower to increase the speed of the engine. We were about to land, to be safe, quick, while the sky was still quiet. An empty raft crossed our path, heading back for the east bank. We looked at it coldly. Any movement toward the east made us shiver. Then the west bank was only 20 yards away. We no longer dared to move for fear of foundering, despite an intense joy which we would have expressed in other circumstances by jumping and shouting. After so many days and hours of waiting and despair, we had been saved. Then there were only 10 yards, then 5. The engines went into reverse to slow us down. We drew up beside a pier made of tied branches, and we heard voices telling us to move slowly and carefully. With a sense of enormous privilege, we stepped, one after the other, onto the solid earth, which is to say, onto a quagmire exactly like the east bank. But the mud no longer mattered. We had crossed to the other side. The west bank meant for human safety, a barrier pronounced in the reference. We were For so long and so intensely, we almost felt as if they were a barrier between us and the war itself. We would hold on to the Dnieper. The enemy would not pass beyond that line, and in the spring we would push them back beyond the Volga. During our long and painful retreat to the river and our endless wait, our thoughts had crystallized around this idea, and actually stepping onto the West Bank seemed like the end of our misfortune. Reorganization, clean clothes, leave, and the assurance that we had not been beaten. Of course, the West Bank was still Russia, but it was the part of Russia which had welcomed us a few years earlier, the part of Russia which really favored us. Our exhausted brains clung to this fantasy. The West Bank was almost the motherland. The officers and soldiers waiting to direct us were not particularly agreeable, and the military police, with their badges glistening damply in the fog, were downright unpleasant. All organizations have police, and some of them must be fine fellows. However, we wanted to forget the police at Romny, and on the retreat from the Don, to preserve some of the joy we felt at being back in the West. We tramped along, herded by a couple of fellows in a sidecar covered with mud. They didn't bother to line us up in threes, but let us walk any way we liked, almost as if we were out for a stroll, which was a pleasant variation of usual practice. Maybe they knew what a hard time we'd had and had decided to give us a break. Now that we were out of it, maybe everything was going to be all right. The sidecar forced us to increase our pace. We went on for about 1.5 miles, stumbling through the mud and splattering our companions, to arrive finally at a big camp, where the men who'd crossed ahead of us were already waiting. It was dark and a fine rain was falling. We could see the barbed wire gleaming with wetness. 2 soldiers with machine guns under their arms waved us through a makeshift entrance. Then we stopped, and the sidecar drove rapidly away. We stood where we'd been left, surrounded by barbed wire, not knowing what to think. We tried to tell ourselves that this was just how things happened in the army, and that this welcome seemed excessively cold because we were fresh from the hell of Konotop. They were probably making us wait so that they could take us straight to clean, comfortable barracks where we would sleep and regain our strength. Or perhaps they were getting our passes ready. This last idea filled us with joy and annihilated the liquid mud, the rain, and the barbed wire, which in reality held us prisoner.